Hello everyone, Redcoat here, lead designer and producer for Vernacular Games. I've got Dragoncoder here with me. Say hello, Dragoncoder.
Hello, Internet.
And today, we haven't got our dice roller here, so we won't be hitting RNG. Instead, we're going to go into storytelling and a little bit about what's good about storytelling in games, some of the games that we think didn't do it so hot, and also what we can do to try and do that a little bit better in the future. So actually, I'm going to hand this one off to Dragoncoder to start. What do you think of when you think of some games that have done it pretty well? Do you have any standouts in your gaming history?
Well, there's one that's always been it's a blast from the past for me, and it's certainly something in my mind that stands out as a really great showpiece for what stories can be done in video games, or how stories can be done in video games, rather. It's a game series, really, a trilogy, from the PlayStation era called Colony Wars. For background on it, it's a space flight sim. They're not traditionally... Well, we don't think of them anymore as very strong bastions of story. They're kind of more action, or they're the free-form sandbox games nowadays. But in the PlayStation era, in early PC gaming, they were actually, just kind of sortie simulators where you're going out as a fighter pilot in space, doing various missions. In Colony Wars, specifically, so the first game starts out, you're fighting as a member of this resistance against the Earth Empire that was going out from Earth to all of the various human worlds. And the interesting thing with the story on this one was not so much what the story was or anything, but how it was portrayed and how you could see it. Because if you fail a mission, the standard model is, you failed the mission, retry. On this one, you failed a mission, you get to see how that impacts the story, and you get to play from there. Now, this also meant that there was a lot of different endings, and if you fail the first mission, you still got a game over. It was the first mission. You needed to actually succeed that one, but though it was rather easy. But later on, you could fail missions. You get halfway through the game, you start failing missions. You'll get a wildly different outcome at the end than if you had succeeded all the way through to the end. The best ending, by winning everything, and I suppose this is the other really cool part about this, is that the canon ending that went into the next game was the second best ending that you could get in the first game. The really best ending was you conquer and topple the Earth government, you conquer Sol, and you remove the tyrannical Earth government. But the second best ending is, you get to the Earth system, or Sol system rather, and then you seal it off so that the Earth government can't come out and do stuff anymore. And in the second game picks up, you're in the Empire soldier, and you're fighting back out from the Sol system, and the rebel government has turned tyrannical now, and so it kind of plays the other side of it. But it had that same mechanic for telling the story. You could fail missions but still see what happens and go on. You could lose a battle every now and then and still keep the story mostly on track, which is, I suppose, the other really cool thing. It gave opportunities for the player to fail and see how that impacted things. And the third game had that to the same. Well, it had the same thing, but it played off to less of an extent. There was less of a clear and present other enemy, because at the end of the second game, the rebels and the Earth government are kind of unified, and then in the third game, you're fighting these alien things, and that one kind of faltered a bit.
So thinking about some of the games that I played that actually caught me from the standpoint of their stories. Now, these ones are a little bit in the more traditional sense of a story that you kind of, your interaction with the story is more that it's being told to you than necessarily you're in it, you're changing it. Which is of note, because this means that it's not necessarily maximizing the usage of the medium per se, but it's still kind of doing it well. a lot of the stuff that showed up in actually the Tales of series, specifically Tales of Symphonia, and to a little bit less of an extent, Tales of Graces. No, not Tales of Graces, excuse me. Although that one did have a decent story-ish, not as strong as some of its counterparts. But Tales of Vesparia, yeah, those two in particular in the Tales of series. There's actually a lot of games in the Tales of series. With Symphonia, it was specifically the story that was being told was actually very interesting. You had an interesting world that was happening, and the conflict itself was very multifaceted, let's say, because the concept was that you basically find the mystic MacGuffin, who is a who as opposed to a what, and you take her and you're trying to save the world by freeing up. Well, I think it was like collecting the summoned spirits.
Actually, I believe, if I remember correctly, it wasn't you were collecting this. The summoned spirits didn't play a part until the second part of the story.
Aye.
You were going to the shrines to revive the mana in the world for the first part of the game.
Right, and that's actually where we get to the crux, because you're reviving the mana in the world, but what you're actually doing, you find this out like later on, is that you're taking mana from another world. And being that your main character is kind of heroic, and your cast of characters are also kind of in that altruistic vein, you end up with this conflict of, well, we don't want to just kill the other world to save our world. And so this existential crisis kind of starts happening where the characters are trying to figure out how to save both worlds. And at the same time, the inhabitants of the other worlds are kind of still fighting for their own survival. There's a lot of intricacies and things there. I'm actually glossing over a great deal of stuff that happens in the game, partially because if you want to play it, you don't want spoilers.
Yeah, I think you're glossing over about like 30 hours of gameplay for the story.
Yeah, it's a great game. You should play it. You should play it, but just know it's old. You want to get the special edition that came out a while ago that fixes the camera and makes it so that 2-player and multiplayer play is actually a little bit better. But I digress. As far as storyline was concerned, that one was really interesting to me. Now, jumping over to Tales of Vesparia, which is a little bit clearer in my mind because I played that a little bit more recently because it was a later game. Tales of Vesparia, one of the things that it did really well was it just established some really strong characters. I remember one of the jokes we had when we got introduced to Yuri Lowell, our main protagonist, purple dude who was actually not a teenager. Shock. And a JRPG without a teenage main character. That is more rare than some would know. I think some of you know just how rare that is, but he was actually, kind of an adult, and he had actually aged that way. So it wasn't necessarily a coming of age story, but more of a deciding what to do about how the world worked, and actually sticking to your guns when you make a decision. And I mean, we always joked about Yuri Lowell being kind of a Batman type character, but he was a very stylish Batman type character. And of course, he had his foil in the form of, was it Flynn?
Yeah, his name was Flynn.
Yeah. He had his foil in the form of Flynn. What was interesting was they took the choice of, you didn't really see much of what Flynn was doing, and I think this was in part because it's an RPG, so you're sticking most of your time with the rest of the party. You just knew that he was trying to do things the right and upstanding way, whereas you were kind of the vigilante doing things on the outside. But overall, it just had a very, very strong cast of characters. The story was a little bit weaker. It didn't really have a very strong villain, but the characters themselves just stuck out a great deal in that game. So, that's kind of what I've got to say about that one. But moving forward into the concepts of some of the weaker stories that we've seen in games, there's actually a plethora of things with weak story, but I think what we want to do is we want to kind of lock it into things that try to have a good story and end up weak anyway. So while I'm contemplating exactly where that is, Dragon Coder, you got anything?
Yeah. So one that actually really sticks out into my mind, very much a more recent game, the Mass Effect series. Um, yeah, it's probably something where most of our listeners probably already know of this, but it's basically, they tried to do, branching storyline where your decisions mattered and all of that. And I'll admit it, to a point they succeeded. There's definitely a lot of choices that you make that have consequences even in later games. But the thing is that if that's the point of the story, the games really, in a way, ended in Mass Effect 3 halfway through that. There's two particular points in that game where your previous choices actually have a major impact. And that's on, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't played it or already heard about it. But on Tuchanka and on the Corian homeworld. On these two planets, storylines that have started in Mass Effect 1 and 2, they have their culmination. And you have a really great sense of completion and finality there. The thing is that the game then continues with this whole overarching plot of the Reapers. And their conclusion at the end of the game 3, your choices up till then almost didn't matter, because you were faced with one final choice, left or right, or, after one of their patches, middle. And that determined your ending. Nothing else you did really mattered. It affected, how people thought of you, who lived and who died, kind of helped shape some of people's epilogue stories. But overall, left, right, or center, that was the really big thing that affected the ending. And almost to an extent, it was the other side on it. Left and right were kind of how to put it, they were different flavors of the same ending. Humanity survives, things continue, but, it's just whether or not you were in control of the Reapers or the Reapers died off.
Yeah, definitely. That was actually one of the big things. Because I do agree on the Mass Effect score. There were a lot of interesting attempts, a lot of interesting ideas there, and I have to give them kudos for attempting them. But it does again come to the fact that at the very end, a lot of your earlier decisions just didn't quite factor in. There's also some things with just implementation of some of the decisions, of how some of the decisions were done. But this is more of a personal disappointment, because it was something that I saw at the end of a Mass Effect 2 that I was just, when I saw it, and I was like, oh, that is amazing. Wait, why wasn't the rest of the game this? And that was the last mission in Mass Effect 2, because throughout the game you're doing this. I think I'm going to be really off base on my movies, but it's kind of a Dirty Harry Ocean's 11 deal where you're gathering the crew to do the thing. It's not necessarily a heist, but you're getting all of your people together, your specialists, and then you've got them. The whole idea being that you need them to do this final thing. So, okay, that's kind of cool. That's kind of interesting. And so it explains a little bit of why the last mission is so different from the rest. But the last mission is basically, normally you go into a mission, you pick your two buddies, and you're like, all right, Grunt, you're a Grunt. You're my Grunt now. And then you get Tali, because who didn't love that character? Somebody's probably saying, I hated her. But that's okay. You can have your opinion. You take those guys down, you do your mission, and they might have a little bit of insight on what's happening. They'll change some of your dialogue options, your dialogue trails, and then get back on the ship after you've done your mission, and things will happen. So with that, the last mission, you choose your writing buddies, but all throughout the mission, the rest of your crew, you have to make decisions about where you're going to put them. Like, you get to a point where, we have to get through this room, and there's a hacking terminal that's inside of a superheated pipe. Spoilers. We already kind of gave that warning, but I'm going to give it to you again. Turns out when you talk about story, you kind of spoil things. But so you're like, okay, so I need somebody who's good at hacking, but also somebody who, if they're put into a superheated situation, they don't just die. And so you have to decide between, do you put your metal man in there? Do you put your black dude in there? Seriously, I didn't know any other defining traits of that character. I'm sorry, he's just black. This is a black man saying that a black man was black in a game. So don't worry, I'm not being racist. Anyway, so you make your decision, and you're like, okay, put them in there. But then you move on to the rest of the mission, and if you made a bad decision there, that person's kind of injured, and you can't put them into another section. And all throughout the mission, you have to make these decisions about, okay, who's best suited to this? I'm going to set them to go there. And that made me feel a lot more like Commander Sheperd, as opposed to just Sheperd, the crazy, super strong badass, Which, admittedly, there's a place for the power fantasy, but you're Commander Sheperd. That's a part of the lore, so that needs to be reflected in the mechanics.
Yeah, and I really agree with that, and I can understand why they didn't have that anywhere else in Mass Effect 2. If you made really poor decisions in other missions, you would have been completely screwed on that mission. Although, admittedly, that would have made a really awesome story, thing to do. But that is also, I was really sad that they didn't really have anything like that for Mass Effect 3, ever. They introduced that awesome, really cool thing in Mass Effect 2, and I was actually kind of expecting something like that, if anything else, for the capstone mission for Mass Effect 3. You kind of saw everyone else doing stuff, I think.
Yeah, kind of, sorta. You kind of, sorta saw everyone else doing stuff in the sense of it's more of that cutscene. You remember this guy? There he is. He's doing his thing. All right, back to what you were doing. Okay, yeah.
But yeah, it again, it didn't give you the feeling of being Commander Sheperd. It didn't make you feel like what you were deciding really mattered. It mattered for your own survival, but not for how the fate of the galaxy turned out, which is really supposed to be what that game was supposed to be about. It was you making choices and decisions that help shape how the galaxy could survive. This thing that has been wiping off all sentient life, for who knows how many times.
So while I was thinking about, trying to zero in on some games that tried to do storytelling and then kind of failed at it, I thought of some more ones that I remember for doing it good, which this is kind of how thinking works, I suppose. But this brings me actually to the Star Ocean series and how it handled a lot of its character additions. So the Star Ocean series is a little bit older. You have, I believe, its originals were back on the SNES era, and then we moved into the PlayStation era. I never got to play the first one. Star Ocean Till the End of Time was actually my first, and actually I think it was my only Star Ocean. And with that game, they ran into one of the common issues of today's games, which is that voice acting is expensive, 3D modeling is expensive, and you get to making your game, and you're like, okay, so these are the things that we want to have in here. And we've got a lot of cuts that we are going to have to make. Lord help us if we don't want to have to make them. But by the time you get to the end of development, you're like, oh crap. Well, something's got to give. And you can see that a little bit in how some of the stats work on some of the extra characters you get in that game. But one of the big things about Star Ocean Till the End of Time was, while the main story didn't really change, and this is partially because it was a really complex sci-fi story. Spoilers, just a heads up, because it's kind of important for this one. But the characters themselves, the impact that they had was more of, as you went through the game, you made specific decisions about what to do with them, how to deal with them, when you took them anywhere, and also what type of civilizations you allowed them to be exposed to. As that was a thing about Star Ocean, it was about the concept of it's kind of that Star Trek concept of where you have many, many planets in a different galaxy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of their tech curves are the same. So you could end up in a planet that is in the medieval ages, and when you whip out a laser gun, they're like, oh, that's magic. And that's actually kind of the story in a lot of Star Ocean games, is like you end up someplace that's primitive, and then you have to make some decisions about how you're supposed to interact with them. Also, usually the primitive place has discovered magic and uses it differently than maybe your initial society does. But I digress. One of the big things that it did well with its characters was just having them make decisions about how they dealt with you. Some characters would leave if you did things the wrong way. Other characters would disappear for long periods of time and then reappear right when you needed them. But the idea was this thing of where you could actually use them. They would actually just say, you're not the kind of person I want to be around. See ya. And things like that. You could miss them very easily. This is more apparent in the original Star Ocean. Granted, I didn't play it, but I've talked to a lot of people about it. So I might not be quite as qualified to talk about that one, but I do know in so much that game had a lot of characters that you could miss, and it also had differing characters that you could run into just based on who you started with and where you went from there. Because you could either start as a part of the feudal society, or start as a star traveler stranded there.
Well, it's actually interesting on the point of characters. It got me kind of thinking, because there's actually one point, at least in story, that I thought was really kind of cool and interesting, was actually Final Fantasy VII, and I think almost everyone knows where I'm going from on that one with characters in Final Fantasy VII. It's, they had a point where they kill off a character, Eris or Aerith, depending on how pedantic you want to be with that. But there's 2 points that I think that are really, I have to give them kudos for that on. It's the fact that they went ahead and fully killed off a character, and they did that within the first third of the game. So it was a major thing, and it kind of drove a couple of the characters, to continuing on, and it was kind of a big thing for the game story. But it was the fact that you had the character long enough that you felt you could rely on having them in your party, and then they yanked that away. But it was also the fact that, thinking back on it, Aerith or Eris was the most adept at doing magic, and especially doing healing magic. So I think that was, to me, that was
It was a big blow, because from a certain standpoint, whenever you think of an RPG game, what's the most common character class that you're going to have in your party? You're almost always going to have a healer in your party, unless you're trying to do things differently. But usually you're going to have a healer in your party. It's a crux portion, so most players would get attached to their healer character. Which is why specifically taking away that character in that role can have such an effect. There haven't been as many chances taken in that sort of area of, let's say, mechanical storytelling, I think. The concept of giving the player something and then taking it away, and taking it away in a way that is very final.
Yeah, because actually I can think of a couple other games where, there's a character that, goes through a permanent death, but there are so many of those that I know of where you get a replacement. It's either someone who's very similar or, has a lot of things. Like, actually going back to Tales of Symphonia, there's a point where you have kind of this mentor figure who's this, what's called a magic swordsman for the Tales games. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's basically someone who can use swords and use magic, and they have a specific set of abilities that, in those games, when you see a magic swordsman, they're going to have these skills that you can use. And there's a certain point in the story where he leaves the party, and it's a fairly final leaving for him. But then almost immediately, or very shortly thereafter, you get basically him, but he's a different character. Mechanically, you get the same character. In terms of story and character interaction, he's different. But it's the fact that, I guess the thing is, like in Final Fantasy VII, they don't give you someone to replace Eris. There's no one who fills that same role. There's no one who has the same stats.
And thinking on the Final Fantasy series, that's a series that kind of, I would say, kind of lives or dies on some of its storytelling. I mean, it's in the JRPG area. which, the Japanese RPG. Again, I feel like there's probably a more descriptive term. Another time we'll go over, try and figure that one out. But in a lot of the Final Fantasy games, what you're really getting in there for is there's a crazy story that's going to happen. And I kind of emphasize the crazy. Some of them are really convoluted. Others of them just kind of fall flat. I would say to an extent 10-2 that kind of didn't really hit me very well. The dress system, or rather the mechanical play was really good. And it might just be the dude in me, but it felt like Jam meets Barbie, and I felt like it was kind of a disservice to Yuna as a character as well, for where they took her and what they did with her in that game. Again, this is as a dude speaking, so a female might have a different opinion on that, but that's where I kind of stand on that game. But yeah, the Final Fantasy series in general, really, it lives or breathes off of its stories. And one of the things I think is interesting about those series is they tend to err in this direction of lots and lots of backstory, lots and lots of world mechanics. This world works this specific way, and you need to really understand what's going on. You have to learn a great deal about their magic system, about their societal systems. That can be a little bit daunting. I know in Final Fantasy XIII, that was one of the things that came up, was just there were a lot of made-up words, I will say, that you needed to start grasping. And they weren't necessarily explained to you. And, not having stuff explained to you is not a bad deal. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just when they're thrown at you left and right.
Especially if it's something where the characters are assumed to already know that. I feel that explaining it just so that the player can get the understanding, I feel that's a disservice to the story. I feel that there are better ways of doing that. Some games go with that by, there's this person who doesn't know what's going on. They're really just, proxy for the audience, the players, to get the information. There's, stuff like, as much as I hate for the amount of information, the Mass Effect Codex is a fairly good way of doing a lot of that. It's the library. If you want to learn about it, go to the library. That kind of thing.
Yeah. That actually brings me to another form of mechanical storytelling, which I felt was very well integrated, which was in the Metroid Prime series, actually. Which, you could say that, after a fashion, the story in that game isn't really... We'll say it's not Shakespearean prose in video gaming. That's not what Metroid was there for. It wasn't there to tell you a story. But at the same time, there was a great deal of world development and a telling of what was happening all around you, that all you needed to do was look. And I think this was really interesting because it was a core part of the game that allowed you to learn about the rest of the world. And by this, I mean your scan visor. Whenever you wanted to figure out what you needed to do in a room, you were going to scan it. You were going to look for the scannable objects, figure out what you could interact with. But you also ended up just scanning a whole bunch of other random things in the process. And it wouldn't just say, no dice here, sorry, there's not a thing. It would usually be a thing like, hey, that's a fern. They grow in this way, in this place, and it looks like they're getting choked by the acid. Or, that was made by a space pirate, and it looks like that space pirate died through a laceration. Not quite sure what came through here, but he's fresh. Little things like that.
It just reminds me of one of my favorite scanner entries for that was, or series of them, was records of the space pirates trying to replicate the morph ball that Samus could do. It's just all the descriptions of the horrible mangling that always happened because of that.
Yeah, and I mean that's some really cool world immersion stuff. Little nods to the player to keep them in there and give them a little bit more of a reason to suspend their disbelief for just that much longer. And so again, this is, like I said, this is more of a form of a little bit of mechanical storytelling, and that's one of the things that I feel is the strength that video games have, is that concept of being able to tell a lot about the game mechanically, or being able to tell a story mechanically, letting you either experience the story or affect it in a way that couldn't normally be done.
I actually Another game that stands out for me is actually Highway to the Moon, uh, because I actually remember going through development. We had a story lined out at first, and then due to technical limitations, for a little while we just decided we weren't going to do a story. It was just going to be, go through the levels. It's an arcade game. You don't really need to know what's going on. You just know that there are things shooting at you and you shoot back. But then we figured out a way of actually implementing dialogue into the game, and it's actually something that you play through. It doesn't interrupt gameplay, and I felt that was kind of rather neat. But there's also the fact that because of how we did that, there was this interesting little side effect of where you could shoot all of the dialogue bubbles and blow them up. So, and we use that for, it's a great way of getting power-ups and everything, and it adds great to the replay value, because if you've already seen it, you can just blow it up, get cool stuff, and keep going, and you actually go through it maybe a little bit faster because of how the scripting for the levels work.
Definitely. That is still probably one of my favorite parts of that game. Was just, it was one of the favorite parts, and it's funny because it was something that it came out of us trying to figure out what to do. And when we realized that, I think it was an idea I had of just like, wait, we can just put the text on an enemy. That's how you talk. You just spawn an enemy that is your voice. And then you can blow up your voice. Yeah, it was very fun in that way. And then, there was an achievement for blowing up every text box in the game. Well, almost every text box in the game. Yeah, that was... that's one of the things. Is like, again, storytelling, interactive storytelling, isn't just that concept of, you've got a story to tell, and then, you get in there and you change the way it goes, but it's also making it so that the conveyance of the story is a really cool and interesting thing. There are plenty of games that kind of have some of that going on with them. I think of L.A. Noire as one of them, because that's a detective story. And so the very concept is that you're trying to figure out what the story is. You're trying to discover what's happening. And so your interaction with the story is non-trivial. And that changes a lot. It's very different from just reading a detective novel, I would say.
Yeah, and actually I would also say, like, in a similar way of, like, trying to find the story, a lot of the more modern sandbox games, like Minecraft, or one that actually sticks out for me is Elite Dangerous. I've been playing that quite a bit recently, and so on that one, there's no real, like, story objective. The story you play through is just where you're kind of this dude in this world, and it's really your choices. It's the story about you being in this world, doing what you would do, and and how the world reacts to that.
So, looking at some of the things that we've gone over, I feel like it would be very, let's say, prudent to kind of explore, like, how to do these things, because really that's kind of what's important as we move forward as an industry, and certainly as Vernacular Games. That's one of the things that we definitely want to try and do whenever we're looking at any game concept, is like, how do you do this? How do you make a good story in a game, and how do you leverage what makes games and use that to tell a good story? So we hit a little bit on the concept of mechanical storytelling, which is just the idea that the things that you interact with, how you play the game, is a part of the storytelling. So things like, say you had a game of where you may lean left or right, or maybe in like several different directions, as far as say you have the ability to cosmetically change yourself genetically, and this might actually have an effect on how people look at you, and more importantly, an effect on how you do things. And so the further you throw yourself in specific directions, the more your gameplay changes, and then also the more the world around you reacts to you differently. Those two things are two separate areas, but they're both a part of the gameplay. They're both a part of the story. One lets you feel the story, and the other one lets you interact with the story, so to speak.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I mean, and also to look at how how to make games with interesting story, and utilizing gaming medium as a specific means of telling a story. Like, I've had actually been thinking on a game idea, and story is kind of a big part on it, because part of it is like trying to fit an actual story, or overarching story into kind of like a sandbox world environment. Is kind of trying to do this as kind of a mind experiment, maybe, eventually turn this into a game. And just thinking, it's like a lot of them nowadays have it where you like the world itself is not determined by a designer. It's something that the computer makes by, random seed generally. And so doing that, and you have how the world is set up and how you start in that world affects how you start. It can affect how the world itself even interacts with itself. If you have all these different nations in a world, but they're spread out randomly. So sometimes, this really warlike nation on some people's games could be, next to this really peace-loving nation, and they start sharing their culture, and, so they start balancing out where, this peace-loving nation starts getting a little bit more militaristic because it has to defend itself from this, really warmongering race. But this really warmongering race starts seeing that, well, maybe that's not the way to go about things all the time. And then, this mercantile group could be off on their own, completely severed off from everyone, and wither off and die because they don't really have anyone to trade with, but that was, what they were really good at. Admittedly, figuring out, well, how did they get really good at trading if they were always off by themselves that's kind of where all this kind of falls apart a little. But
yeah, that concept of we'll say a intelligently seeded procedurally generated game. The concept that while there's a lot that gets generated at the start that you don't really have control of as a designer, and moreover, you have willingly relinquished control of these elements. But at the same time, you go and you seed how those elements get generated. Basically, you give them the core starting bits, and then you let them intermingle for a while, and that will create a new world, but you still know things about it. Moreover, after doing that sort of mingling bit, then you do a little bit to gain an understanding of how those bits will interact, and start watching for different key elements to appear, even designing the game to make those happen.
Yeah, I kind of feel that there's quite a bit to explore, in this realm, an idea of emergent world building. Some games in indie have done this, but I still think there's a lot of room left to explore in that facet.
And definitely when we say emergent storytelling and emergent story, it should be noted that the term is usually used to reference when the community looks at a game and says, hey, this is totally what the story is. Maybe not necessarily it's something that the developer did. But when we're talking about is specifically the story actually emerges from the game. It is intended that the game itself creates a new story that you interact with. And every time you play it, unless you specifically are given control over the seeds, every time you play it, you're going to see something a little bit different, something a little bit more interesting. That would be the concept. I mean, we see that a lot in a lot of roguelikes, but with the idea of specifically seeding it, this allows you to do slightly more interesting and slightly more deliberate things. But moving on from procedurally generated stories and also interactive stories, which this is still an important part of our medium, and definitely probably one of the more important parts of our medium is the fact that you can interact with the story and make it change. But there's still a place for the story that is told to you, that you basically play alongside. That's things like Bayonetta or...
The thing that comes to my mind on that is definitely games like Heavy Rain, or there was another game more recently, I forget the name of it, something like, it's not The Long Dark, but something along those lines of...
Oh yeah, the game that highlighted the butterfly effect and used that greatly in its aesthetics. I cannot remember the name of the thing. Well, that's a challenge to you guys in the comments section. If you can tell me what that game was, it involved a lot of psychology. It had a lot of... Actually, that one was one that you kind of played alongside, but you did affect the story, and you decided who lives and who dies. It was a horror game. Yeah, you see, I know all of these things about it. I don't remember the name. It's not even on the tip of my tongue. But in any case, yeah, but the stories that you play alongside, I mean, JRPGs also have this sort of thing where it's the story is more that it takes you through a bunch of different battles, but the story gives credence to what you're doing in those battles, and also gives you an idea of it's more of like you're following the tale of these characters. It's like it's not actually you, but it's these characters that you're following the story of, and so you're being told their story. And I mean, there's a lot of things there that go in. I mean, some of the basic tenets of good storytelling. You know, you have fully fleshed out characters. You have a plot line that actually has interest and kind of changes along the way. Or if it doesn't change, it's just intrinsically interesting in how it's presented. But from the standpoint of when we're looking at telling a story in a game, one of the things is that whatever is your plot line, that you are around it as the game goes along. Like, it doesn't just play out without you, per se. Even if you're not necessarily directly affecting it and you're kind of playing alongside what's happening, it still feels like you're in there. Like, if it's a game, say if it's a game about an alien infestation happening on a satellite, then you want to actually be near the infestation. It's kind of unrealistic to, say, have you be at every single event that happens, but seeing as we're doing a story, we're imitating reality, not necessarily being reality. That gives us the ability to do these bombastic, crazy things, where it's just like, you were at every single point where the aliens showed up. Or you could make it where you play as multiple people that all interacted at a different point. This actually makes me think of Alien Isolation, which was hit and miss for people because not everyone actually encountered the alien. It was one of those concepts of you have a randomness that is not seeded. It is simply happening because the AI is deciding to do different things around there, and because the AI isn't necessarily corralled, the player may lose some of that tension because they may never see the alien ever throughout the game. At least that's. I can't say that for full, as I have not fully played the game. I would have to. This is more again from a lot of how the game was talked about, what people have told me about their experiences with the game. So that's another one for the comments section. If you played Alien Isolation, specifically if you played it, or perhaps if you know someone who did and they told you about their experience, go ahead, tell us a little bit about that. Moving on from that, the concept of telling a good story, one big thing is that you want to be around what's actually being told. Your characters should be involved in it in some way, or unless that's like the focus of the story, is that you're just on the sidelines and you're watching it all unfurl. But if that's the case, then you've got to do some interesting things to pull that off, I'll say.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely say that, for that kind of storytelling, you definitely need to take a lot of cues from, say, like, storytelling in films a lot, because there's still that projection that happens from the audience or players onto the characters that are in the movie or game, depending on, again, the terminology is a bit wonky, but it is that, there's a lot of cues you can learn from those, because there's still, how to get the audience engaged, how to convey the story and the world setting and show that if something happened off screen, it happened there for a reason, how to show what happened there, how to follow multiple characters, how to follow a single character through all of it. Cinema has a long and huge history, and there's a lot that can definitely be learned there for doing kind of, for lack of a better term, traditional storytelling.
Yeah, I'd say that's actually the proper term there. If we're looking at storytelling in games, I think that would be, we've got multiple terminologies that we can use. We have fully interactive gameplay. We have fully interactive storytelling, which means that the aspects of the story greatly depend upon what the player does. Non-trivially, they greatly depend on what the player does. We haven't seen, well, I won't say that we haven't seen many massively complex games that really let this run loose. I think Dragon Age is kind of an example of this sort of deal happening. Mass Effect was attempting to be that, and to an extent it succeeded in certain areas, for sure. And then you have the game that is the more traditional storytelling, where you are playing the game, yes, but you're not really fully affecting the story. Rather, it's being thrust upon you to live through. There are plenty of examples of this. The concept that comes to mind is any of the Drake adventure games, which, again, I'm blanking on names. This is horrible.
You mean the Uncharted series?
Yes, the Uncharted series. Good man, Dragon Coder. You've saved me again from my own horrible memory. But yes, the Uncharted series is a great example of a game that takes a lot of cues from film, but is still really enjoyable as a game. And it's a story, it is again a game that you play alongside the story. Like, no matter what happens, Drake's gonna win in the end, you know. He's gonna get into some scrapes. Well, okay, so he might not win in the end, if you game over.
Yeah, this is Drake winning in the end depends heavily on, do you as a player overcome the challenges presented to you by the story?
Yes. So, we'll say, if the player is good enough, basically, are you Drake enough to be Drake? Can you Drake the Drake so hard that you win? But yeah, that's the thing. The main thing that is dependent on the player is, do you succeed? Otherwise, everything that happens, like whether or not you halfway get to the area with half health or get to the area with full health, when you're on the train, you're going to be attacked by a helicopter. And Drake's going to be like, why am I being attacked by a helicopter? That's always going to happen. And we love it for that. We do, because the thing about the traditional storytelling is that it allows you to create these areas and do those jokes, do those puns, do those things that you can only do when you set it up, as opposed to the fully interactive, where you may not necessarily be able to craft every experience that the player encounters, which means you won't know everything that they're going to run into. That's just kind of how it goes. Moreover, you may not be able to get that climax that a well-crafted story has, because your well-crafted stories are very well structured, and the procedurally generated, fully interactive game is less structured. And I suppose that would be the thing, is fully interactive is not necessarily procedurally generated. Those are two very, very different things. And also one other thing that traditional gives you is voice acting budget. It's less! Oh man, it's super cheap. It's a lot cheaper when you don't have to record the lines 15 times over for every different decision that's made. This is part of the reason why going with a voiceless game is not necessarily a bad idea. It just means you've got some more options available to you. If you can get it fully voice acted, that's amazing. I'm not quite sure how you funded that, but that's amazing. Incidentally, Fallout, the most recent Fallout, and how they got all of that voice acted, I'm gonna give them kudos for getting that bankrolled. I mean, they're a bigger company, so they can afford some of that, but that's still a thing. That's actually a part of the game development process, although I'm getting off topic now. But yes, procedurally generated, fully interactive, traditional. Those are three forms that I can think of for storytelling. The fully interactive part can actually be put into either the procedural or the traditional. I'm feeling like there's more out there, and it looks like Dragon Coder's got something on his mind here.
I was mostly just thinking of, how to do a fully interactive traditional story. But yeah, now that you say that it's been kind of been done, but then I'm thinking, yeah, that's a lot like Dragon Age and Mass Effect and those types of games.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, if you succeed, you will win the day. If you succeed when you get to the end, you're going to defeat the big bad. That case is true in Dragon Age, in each of the Dragon Ages. It's mostly just kind of how you get there a little bit that changes. It's basically kind of ovoidal storytelling, and by that, when I say that, I mean the storytelling branches are like an oval, where it starts small at one end, and then it expands until you get to the large diameter at the center. And then it focuses back in when you get to the very end. And so the middle is where a great deal of the variance is. That would be fully interactive traditional storytelling. And so seeding a procedurally generated thing would be basically I guess that would be taking elements of traditional storytelling, but not really. I feel like that might be its own thing, or just a variant therein of procedurally generated.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that.
So with that, I think that kind of covered a lot of the stuff we wanted to talk about. So to kind of recap, we talked a little bit about some of the games we felt had some really good storytelling in the past. We hit on Mass Effect as far as what it kind of did cool, some of the stuff it did badly. I say that one specifically just because it's still one of the hotbed games. I would say it's still kind of a marker in gaming history. So definitely something to examine when it comes to storytelling.
And I'd say a large part of that is the fact that it was doing so well, it had such great high marks, but then it kind of, at least in of a lot of the fan base and with a lot of what's been said about it, and even my own personal experience, it really kind of faltered in the third game. Especially the climax for the third game really seemed to fall flat. Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about that, and then we started getting into things about actually mechanical storytelling, and what that means from a concept, just the idea of telling a story through how you interact with the game. And then we got into implementation of good storytelling and the different types of storytelling in gaming.
Although, caveat there, totally not an exhaustive list.
Most definitely, and that's one of the parts of these whole series is we're exploring this stuff. We're learning this stuff as we go along, just as you are. You, the viewer, or rather the listener, depends on what medium you're using to hear this. But definitely, this is by no means an exhaustive list of the different ways to tell stories in games. If anything, we could probably just do a full recording on just going through gaming history and saying, well, this told a story this way, and this told a story that way, and starting to group things together and figuring out how they all fit.
That could definitely be, a multi-year-long podcast series.
Yeah, I mean, we could certainly try for it. Still not sure on that. And I don't think I really want to take that challenge. Yeah. So, in the end, video games afford us the chance to let the player interact with the story, to let the player feel the story. And that means that we can affect the story either by actually changing what happens in it, or we can simply use the story as a means to provide challenges for the player to encounter. Both of these are interesting and strong approaches to making good games, and I'd love to see what else can come from the idea of letting the game state generate story, generate the different points of story, either creating new enemies or creating new things for the player to deal with, and also reacting with the player. And moreover, allowing the player to really be a player in the story. Allowing the player to be a player. Yeah, that's right. Don't be a player hater. That had nothing to do with that, and I am sorry. Anyway, so I'm gonna go ahead and sign off before I shoot my face off with my mouth. So,
a little late for that, I think.
Yeah. No, the air's been shot full of holes. We've just been shooting the breeze here. So, I'm gonna let Dragon Coder here sign off.
Alright, stay cool out there, Internet.
And this is Redcoat, signing off. Play the stuff you want to play, boyos.